Welcome back, students. It is now time to discuss Module 4. Obviously, by the time we get through this module, we will reach the halfway point of the course. This module focuses on sections or chapters 6 and 7. Activity-based costing, budgeting. Those are the two topics. And they run together pretty well. They are linked in ways that we will explore in this recording. So let's open the textbook, go to Chapter 6, Section 6.3, Calculate Activity-Based Product Costs, and then scooch down to the subtitle of that subsection. I guess you could call it the subsection, entitled The Calculation of Product Costs Using the Activity-Based Cost or Costing Allocation Method. Phew, that's a mouthful. So here's the basic problem here. We use 5 different processes to build different things. We set up machines, we purchase material, we inspect products, we assemble products, and we use technology in production. And those are 5 different things that we do. An accountant would call them 5 different activities that we complete. But depending on what we are producing, we might use more of these activities or less than of these activities. And in fact, for any particular item that we produce, we might use more of one, less of the other, an average amount of the third, etc. And so, if we only do 5 things, if we only conduct 5 activities to build anything that we're going to sell, but for each item that we build, we use differing amounts of these activities. How do we figure out how much it costs to build any given item? Well, in this section, step 1, define what those 5 activities are. Well, we just did that. Step 2, how much is the company and its production facility spending overall for each of these 5 activities? Overall means in total for anything that we might want to be producing. The annual budget, if you will. And as you can see in number 2, or step 2, company is spending $2.5 million in total for all 5 of these activities combined. If you look at step 3, what this step is trying to convey is that you actually have 3 different types of products or services that you are offering to the public, that you are building. And each one of these services uses a different amount of the activity. And so if I want to produce a solo product or service to sell to the public, that product, that item, is going to require 10,000 inspector items. If I produce a band item to sell to the product, it will only require 9,000 inspection hours. On the other hand, if I want to produce, let's say, an orchestra item as opposed to a band item, I'm going to have to use 12,000 pots requiring labor to produce an orchestra item. And I will only need to produce or use 3,000 pots requiring labor for the band item. That's step 3. you're trying to figure out for each of your 3 products or services that you're going to produce and then sell, how many of each activity will you need to use? Now you go to step 4, and let's take a look at setting up machines, the machine setup activity, the first activity of the 5. Well, if in step 2 we realized that we're going to have to spend overall $200,000 on that activity, and for all 3 of our products and services combined, we're going to have to do that 5,000 times. Well, then according to step 4, if you're going to spend $200,000 to set up machines, and you're going to set up machines 5,000 times, then $200,000 divided by $5,000 equals 40 hours per setup. What does that mean? Every time we set up a machine to do anything, it's going to cost on average 40 bucks. I want to produce a solo item? No problem. Every time I set up a machine, 40 bucks. If I want to produce an orchestra item, no problem. Every time I set up a machine, it's going to cost me 40 bucks. Now, if you look back at step 3, I'm going to have to set up machines 2,000 times for the solo item. Only 1,500 times for the orchestra item. So overall, I'm going to spend more money in total to set up machines for solo than for orchestra, because I'll need to set up machines more often for solo than for orchestra. However, no matter what I'm producing, every time I set up a machine somewhere for some product or service, 40 bucks. That's going to be the cost of doing that. And then we go to number 5. What step 5 does is it looks at how many times you're going to do different things in step 3. And it multiplies by the cost per unit or per thing or per activity in step 4. And it thus computes cost in total. And so following along what we just talked about, if based on step 3, we know that to produce the solo item, we will need to set up machines 2,000 times. And if we know in step 4 that every time we set up a machine, it's going to cost us $40, well then we can conclude to produce the solo item, we're going to spend in total 2,000 setups times $40 per setup, or $80,000 in total to set up machines for our solo items. And that's why $80,000 appears in the upper left-hand corner of the chart for step 5. Now, the problem here goes on to say, okay, now that we know how much we're spending for each item, we can start to pull together the total costs of producing an item, not just for these 5 activities, but including everything else that we're going to spend money on. And of course, we've been discussing all those other items in previous chapters of the course. However, in terms of this particular chapter, activity-based costing, what does it cost to perform each of these different activities, given that they vary in terms of number of activities per product or service? That activity-based costing activity is really summarized in these first 5 steps that we just reviewed together. Okay, why is this important? Well, if we now go to the next chapter, chapter 7, the chapter on budgeting, and we look at figure 7.4, that's 7.4. Figure 7.4 in chapter 7 takes what we just discussed to the next level. And remember for a moment, what we just discussed is a way to find out that every time we set up a machine, it's going to cost us $40. And if we're going to have to set up a machine more often for one product or service than the other, then we're going to spend more money on machine setup for that first product. That's what we learned to do in chapter 6. Now let's look at figure 7.4 in chapter 7. This figure emphasizes the importance of creating not just static budgets, which are traditional cost budgets, but flexible budgets as well. Okay, what's all that about? In figure 7.4, let's look at the 3 columns under the title static budget, because that's the traditional budget and that's what we'll look at first. As you see, our budget consists of 6 different things or activities or materials that we have to spend money on. Of those 3 static budget columns, the first column is what is the budgeted cost that we think we're going to spend per unit. Now, that number essentially is analogous to the $40 per unit that we calculated in chapter 6. It's a different problem, so you don't actually see the number 40 here, but these are the dollar amounts that you are spending per unit to produce something. Well then, if in that left column the static budget you have cost per unit, and in the center column it's number of units, in this case units of product that you're selling, then the left column multiplied by the center column equals the total amount of money that you expect to spend on that thing, that activity, or that item. The very first line says, hey, every time I produce a backpack, I'm going to need $5.72. Basically, I will need to spend $5.72 on materials. How many backpacks do I expect to produce? 72,000. So my total cost for materials to produce backpacks are $5.72 times 72,000 units equals $411,840. That's the budget. That's the expectation. Here's a question though. Let's say you get to the end of the period and you actually spend $411,840. In total, you've spent what you've expected to spend. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, if you only have a static budget, that would seem like a good thing. I'm on budget. But whoa, look at the 3 columns on the left. The column's called flexible budget. What the flexible budget says, and once again, let's look at the top row. This is the first 3 columns on the left, top row. The flexible budget columns say, well, yes, we did expect to spend $5.72 for this item, but we didn't actually end up producing 72,000 units. We only wound up producing 71,600. And so given that we actually wound up producing fewer units, we really should not have spent $411,840 after all. We should have only spent $5.72 times 71,600 units, or we should have spent $409,552. In other words, what a flexible budget does is it takes your original cost budget expectation, which is based on an expectation of how much you expect to use or produce, times the cost per unit. And it adjusts your budgeted expectation by how much you actually did produce. It allows you to say, given that I used or produced so much more than expected, I should have spent more than my original budget. And if I did, no big deal. Or, given that I used or produced so much less than I originally expected, I really should have a much lower cost than I originally expected. And if I don't, there's a problem. And that concludes our foray into chapters 6 and 7. Chapter 6 forces you to think flexibly when you try to figure out how much money you are spending to perform each activity for a particular product or service. And chapter 7 says that flexible thinking, that's a good idea, but you also want to think flexibly after you prepare your original budget, because you might want to adjust those expectations based on how many or how few products or services or units you actually produced or consumed. I hope you found this interesting. Congratulations on having reached the halfway point of the course, and I look forward to talking to you again in the next module when we focus on chapters 8 and 9.